Good afternoon, Mrs. Koskinen. I hope I pronounced it right. You will tell me. Can we please test your connection real quick before the start of the meeting? I will give you the floor now, and you can press the speak button once at the bottom. Mrs. Koskinen, in case you're in front of your screen, please press the speak button once.
Okay.
So, yes, now you're coming in. Yes, we can see you. Can you say something? How are you today?
I'm very well. Can you hear me fine?
Please, can you repeat your question?
Can you hear me fine?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. My colleague is okay with that. Yes. Thank you for testing, Mrs. Koskinen, and have a good meeting. Perfect. Thank you.
from Greece, and it is my great pleasure and honor to open today's event, starting by thanking all the participants and congratulating the staff at ENVI who put together such an impressive list of speakers. I think it was a good decision that we decided to have this event after the COP, only a few days after the COP26, in order to take a first stock and discuss what is the ways forward for the climate action movement, for justice and climate justice. Sorry. I think this is very important today because there are opposing views of what the COP achieved, and like every other COP, it failed to meet our great expectations. But I must say, from spending a few days there, that there is a renewed sense of urgency, a renewed sense of commitment, a higher level of ambition and understanding of the problem. And we now are stepping into a world where almost every country in the world has a net zero target, and also a world that is shooting for 1.5 degrees, and which for the first time mentions the need to eradicate fossil fuel subsidies, phase out. So I'm very much looking forward to following your participation and taking into account as we design our next steps in this effort towards fighting the climate crisis. Thank you. Now pass the floor to my dear colleague who will moderate the first panel, Ms. Connie Ernst.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich freue mich auch, hier zu sein und denke, das ist ein sehr wichtiges Treffen. Die Leitung des ersten Panels wird mein Kollege Steffen Schindler übernehmen. Ich will ein paar Bemerkungen machen, noch einmal zu Glasgow, und zwar die Frage stellen, kann man tatsächlich von einer Trendwende sprechen, wenn wir von Glasgow und den Ergebnissen reden? Wir denken, nein. Es ist sehr enttäuschend, dass nicht der Ausstieg aus der Kohle beschlossen wurde, sondern nur die zur Beendigung der Kohleverstromung aufgefordert wurde, obwohl 190 Staaten bereit sind, 190 Staaten, Regionen und Organisationen bereit sind zu sehr viel mehr. 100 Millionen Euro jährlich nach 2023 für Klimaschutzanpassung wurde beschlossen, aber nichts für die Schadensbewältigung, die jetzt schon eingetreten ist für viele Länder. Ein Regelbuch soll es geben für den länderübergreifenden Kohlenstoffmarkt. Dabei müssen Schlupflöcher vermieden werden, sonst macht das keinen Sinn. Es ist insgesamt zu wenig, und ich will kurz antippen, woher unser Politikansatz kommt. Das erste ist, wir verlangen einen Umbau von Staat und Gesellschaft, um in allen Bereichen Klimawandel zu bekämpfen. Dabei lehnen wir blindes Wachstum ohne Berücksichtigung von Sozial- und Umweltkriterien ab. Und der vorherrschende Diskurs ist nach wie vor wachstumsorientiert, wie auch beim Green Deal. Das kann man durchgängig überall finden. Das Zweite ist, wir brauchen den Schutz von Biodiversity als Priorität, und zwar in allen Bereichen. Da müssen wir auch über Landwirtschaft und viele andere Dinge sprechen. Davon sind wir weit entfernt. Wir verlangen den radikalen Ausbau der erneuerbaren Energien, einen praktisch europäischen Marshallplan dafür. Wir setzen uns für eine Mobilitätswende ein, bei der weniger eben mehr ist. Wir können so wie bisher nicht weitermachen. Und bei all diesen Fragen geht es uns darum, das will ich nochmal herausstellen, dass die Bürgerinnen und Bürger von Anfang an in alle Prozesse eingebunden sind. Wir stehen als Fraktion dafür, dass ökologische und soziale Fragen zusammen gedacht und umgesetzt werden. Denn Klimawandel ist auch eine Frage der sozialen Gerechtigkeit, energieeffizienter, bezahlbarer Wohnraum beispielsweise muss allen zustehen, öffentliche Verkehrsinfrastruktur überall, genauso wie die Förderung aber auch von Bürgerenergiegenossenschaften und die Rekommunalisierung für einen nachhaltigen Wandel im Stromsektor. Im Gegensatz zu Konzernen und Lobbyisten haben nämlich Städte, Kommunen und Bürgerinnen ein Interesse an einer nachhaltigen Entwicklung auf lokaler Ebene, weil sie eben dort leben. Das ist unser Ansatz und dafür stehen wir. Erstmal vielen Dank, und ich wünsche der Konferenz das Allerbeste.
Yeah, so thank you all for joining today. As Ms. Cornelia Ernst just mentioned, I will be doing the moderation on her behalf since she's joining remotely. We have interpretation today in French, German, English, Greek, Spanish, Portuguese, and Swedish. Unfortunately, because we're on a very tight schedule, there will not be a Q&A session today. But without further ado, I will hand the floor to Dimitris Tsekeris, who's a climate justice and energy campaigner at Friends of the Earth Europe. And yeah, he will talk about ensuring an accelerated and socially just energy transition, the role of energy communities. You have 12 minutes. I will remind you once you get close to that time, just to stay within the time limits.
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. So I have a presentation to show before I start. You can see the title. So Friends of the Earth Europe is the largest grassroots environmental network in Europe, uniting more than 30 national organizations with thousands of local groups. Here, our Brussels office coordinates our network's joint campaigns, and we push for action by the European Union so as to protect people and planet. So starting, next slide, please. So after this small presentation, we also coordinate the European Community Power Coalition, which is basically a network of more than 40 like-minded organizations referring to the local, national, and international level, who work together to increase people's ownership of renewable energy. Main focus areas are the transposition of Renewable Energy Directive, international legislation for renewable energy communities, state aid guidelines, general block exemption regulation, finance enabling frameworks, capacity building, and so on. So we basically track transposition and implementation of these new rights for communities and citizens. And we basically assess this period that we are right now as a very critical one for the uptake of renewable energy communities and for people's participation. And this is because we believe that this is key towards an inclusive and swift energy transition, and I will refer and elaborate a bit further down the line. So you can see on the right-hand side things that we are working with and what do we basically demand. So next slide, please. So we are in a post-COP26 period. So the aftermath is we have seen that the efforts are not enough to keep the planet below 1.5 degrees. So we also participated in COP26 events. We believe in system change, not climate change, and basically what we saw is the, as we call it, the great Glasgow get out. So unfortunately, the EU has basically shown where its loyalties lie, and this is with, it was in the COP26 with the big polluters. So right now, we need a shift in those ambition levels, and we need to actually do it right now. One example is that during COP26, for instance, we had the PCI list with more than 13 billion euros of gas projects within the EU as the COP26 was continuing. Next slide, please. So, of course, the solution cannot be only one, but we made the statement and intervention during the COP26. We believe that community power is part of the solution, and this is what we stated also in our press release. We strongly believe that the decentralized and 100% renewable energy system is both possible and necessary, while our energy demands must decrease, so talking about energy efficiency. And we strongly believe and work for putting citizens at the heart of our energy transition. Some of our demands, in a very brief way, are sound policies and actions to ensure participation of citizens in the energy transition, immediate financial support for a massive renewable deployment with citizen and municipalities' participation, as well as investment in deeper innovation programs for energy-poor households, referring to energy poverty. So basically, what we are saying is that community energy can play a very important, a major significant role in combating the climate crisis, ending the fossil fuel age, and accelerating the energy transition in a fair, just, and inclusive way. And it can also help tackle energy poverty and also build wide public support for renewables. So now, next slide, please. We're working a lot with Renewable Energy Directive. We have Article 22 of the Renewable Energy Directive stating that member states shall carry out an assessment of the existing barriers and potential of development of renewable energy communities according to Article 22, paragraph 3. So this assessment needs to be done before any enabling framework is created so that the correct barriers are overcome. So all in all, member states shall provide an enabling framework in order to promote and facilitate the development of renewable energy communities, and there are some basic things that these frameworks shall include. So referring to regulatory and administrative barriers that need to be removed, fair, proportionate, and transparent procedures that include cost-reflective network charges, capacity building, support to public authorities in order to set up renewable energy communities. Of course, we know that those enabling frameworks will differ in every country depending on what the biggest barriers in that national context are, and this is why this thing needs to be done prior to any creation of framework. Next slide, please. So talking about renewables and energy communities, one big issue is the acceptance of renewables, which is a divisive issue also in many EU countries. According to a very recent poll that was organized by the European Climate Foundation in 10 different countries, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Spain, Poland, Italy, Czech Republic, Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria, we see that there is massive support for renewables, especially when it is combined with renewable energy communities. So basically, a massive 61% of Europeans would be likely to join an energy cooperative if one were set up in their local region, while 86% of the Europeans support new wind and solar projects in their local area. Next slide, please. Speaking again about the acceptance of energy communities, 79% of Europeans want their governments to provide more financial support for community groups in order to generate their own solar and wind energy. In contrast, only 15% of the Europeans believe that their countries and their governments are doing enough in order to combat climate change. For this reason, we have also published a handbook that is filled with practical tips and wisdom from projects all across Europe. It's now available in 6 languages that refers now to coalition work, and more translations are on their way. Actually, I have brought also some, so if people want, after leaving the room, they can take some. Next slide, please. So the issue of energy poverty. One in 4 European households currently struggle to adequately light, heat, or cool their homes. And that number rises to 1 billion households across the world who do not have access to energy. So we strongly believe that no one should ever have to choose between eating, lighting, or warming their house or paying their rent. According to the Right to Energy Coalition, there have been 3 essential ways to eradicate energy poverty in Europe. Of course, energy poverty is not an issue that solely relies on energy matters, but it refers to many social issues such as the wages, security, and many others. But from our side, we believe that access to affordable clean energy should be a basic human right, decent, energy efficient, and affordable housing for all, and of course, energy democracy, energy communities participation. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, since we are in a tight schedule, we know that the climate crisis is accelerating, and we know that it has devastating impacts, especially to the most vulnerable ones. According to the figure, the image that you see on the right-hand side, we see this disproportionate impact and how it is being allocated, the emissions in the world population. So the richest 10% is responsible for almost half of emissions that are being emitted. Inequalities, according also to that, are rising, and we do have right now the technological tools that are available, and we can use them. The acceptance of renewables is rising when people engage, when people participate in those projects. So now we knew it, but now we also have proof, especially for Europe, and we really believe that it is time to unleash the immense potential of community energy in order to accelerate energy transition through citizens and municipalities' participation that results in increased local acceptance for renewables, wider benefits allocation, that no one will be left behind, and also to create a new way to for solidarity. Many energy communities, and I'm also a part of energy community, when they work in the in the ground level, they develop new techniques and new solidarity actions between each other, between their members, between other energy communities. And this process is also quite important. So we believe also that the EU must further enhance community energy and provide flexibility through, for instance, GBER sounds like an acronym that a bit not easy for everyone to understand. It's the General Block Exemption Regulation. And yesterday, we sent, as a coalition, a letter to Mr. Timmermans, Vice President, and Ms. Vestager, the Commissioner, especially regarding the General Block Exemption Regulation, in order and asking for thresholds and so on. This will be available also on our website. And the last thing I want to say to finish my presentation, and thank you very much also for the invitation, is that this time right now for a real system change. We saw that in the COP26. We saw the ambition of the people outside also COP26 asking for this. And we think that an ecological and social transformation must be the way out in order to address climate crisis, in order to serve the needs of the many with social justice, in order to move away as soon as possible from fossil fuels, so that no one will be left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Also very timely considering the rise of energy prices in Europe, your discussion on energy poverty. We will move right on to Alicia Valero, who is a university lecturer and expert in climate risk management, who will tell us more about resource justice in the digital and ecological transformation. You have 12 minutes.
Mrs. Valero, please press the speak button at the bottom once.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. My name is Alicia Valero, and I would like to show you some of the results that we have been developing throughout several years now. So my talk will be about mineral limits to the green ecological transition, and you will see why this is so. Next, please. So I will start by posing this question towards the green energy transition. Next, please. So it is a fact that clean energy technologies require a greater quantity and variety of scarce raw materials. For instance, according to our studies, 1 gigawatt of wind power requires 25 times more materials than 1 gigawatt of a gas-fired power plant. And the most worrying issue is not the quantity, but the quality of the materials that are used. Moreover, wind energy is the best example, actually, as today cars, because cars are, for instance, the electric vehicle are truly mines on wheels. Next, please. So a couple of years ago, we analyzed the international energy scenarios to decarbonize the economy in terms of exergy, what measures the quality of resources, in short. Not only energy resources, but also mineral resources are considered with this indicator. And the conclusion was that there is going to be a clear shift from fossil fuel dependency to a raw material dependency. Next, please. And this is so because, as I stated before, clean technologies require a greater demand of high quality raw materials. Next. And unfortunately, Europe heavily relies on critical and scarce raw materials that need to be imported, what makes us extremely vulnerable as we are seeing today. Next. The result is that we're experiencing an exponential boom in the demand of raw materials and hence in the extraction. Let me give you this information. During the 21st century, we have extracted as much copper as in the whole history of humanity. Next. And nature's depredation is growing at an almost 3% rate. So this means that in one generation, we will consume twice as much as we do today. And in 25 years, we will have consumed as much as in the whole history of humanity. So this is truly the big problem we are facing and that we haven't understood yet. Exponential growth in a limited planet is not possible. Next. So the result of this exponential extraction implies that mines get exhausted. You can see here in a study that we performed 4 years ago that the production peak of most essential minerals, considering the most optimistic values of resources, could be reached before the end of this century. And the same exercise with reserves brings much closer the peak, most of them well before the middle of this century. Next. So, but not only mineral deposits become depleted, please click next, next, and hence supply of raw material decreases, there is an additional problem with extraction because as ore grades decline with extraction, and according to the laws of thermodynamics, stated here in the graphs that we did with copper, gold, and zinc mines from all over the world, the energy, the waste rock, the water, and emissions associated to mining increases exponentially. And considering that mining is very much dependent on fossil fuels, mainly diesel, and that it will be difficult to electrify mining activities, emissions associated to mining will surely increase, and this sector could become, in fact, the most polluting one in terms of GHG emissions. And this issue has not been considered in energy scenarios. Next, please. So the consequence of all this is clear. There are limits to the green ecological transition. Please, next. So we estimated back in 2018 that demand of 14 elements would be greater than the reserves for silver, cadmium, cobalt, chromium, copper, gallium, indium, lithium, manganese, nickel, platinum, tellurium, or zinc. Next. So minerals that are essential for any electric and electronic equipment, for batteries, and for renewable technologies such as photovoltaics. So what is the solution? Some state that we need to move towards a circular economy. And why have I put this with question marks? Well, I will explain right now. Next, please. The tendency of technological products is that there are increasingly complex products and materials that confer them improved properties and the reduction in size and weight. Next. But impossible to recycle. Next. In a study that we carried out in the past, we analyzed different technological products and we saw that in fact, next please, more efficient technologies, yes, more next, are less efficient from a raw material point of view. Next. So an LED is 10 times more energetically efficient than an incandescent light bulb. However, the light bulb has only some tungsten, aluminum, and glass, yet the LED can contain indium, gallium, arsenic, and many rare earths that are impossible to recycle. So, is the LED truly more sustainable? Next. So, I am sorry, but as a thermodynamicist, I have to say that there is no circular economy. It is a nice myth, but we have a spiral economy instead. Because in each cycle, we lose some materials on the way. But we should aspire to make very large spirals and as many spirals as possible to increase durability and recyclability and trying to lose the least materials as possible in every cycle. Next, please. For instance, in the automotive sector, with which I have and I am closely working, current legislation states that a vehicle should be recycled at a 95% rate in terms of mass. But the reality is that from end-of-life vehicles, it is still, and bad quality still because everything becomes mixed together. Some aluminum and copper are majorly recycled, but where is the neodymium, the indium, the tellurium, the tin, the tantalum, the gold, etc., that are minor but extremely important? Well, they just become lost. And I think manufacturers have now understood very well because car factories are stopping the production of a car that can weigh maybe 1,000 kilograms because of the lack of a semiconductor that weighs only 3 grams. So such minor elements are essential and are being lost. Next, please. So which are the solutions? Next. From the technical point of view, it is important to invest in dematerialization with the KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid. But watch out, because if you miniaturize, it will make recovery almost impossible. And think also that the more electronics, the more scarce raw materials will be needed. We need to substitute scarce materials with abundant ones. This is being done, for instance, reducing the amount of cobalt from batteries. However, if demand for these other materials increases exponentially, sooner or later the abundant ones will also become scarce, as can be the case for nickel if this is massively used in batteries, substituting some amount of the cobalt. Also, we need to design for recycling. It is imperative that all products are robust, hence avoid planned obsolescence. Modularity is important and they should be easily disassembled. We need to practice biomimicry, learning from nature that does not produce waste. And also very important is that we need a solid metallurgical infrastructure, because if in Europe we do not have mines or do not want to have them, at least let's exploit the waste that currently becomes exported. But today, there are only very few companies able to recycle some of the critical raw materials I mentioned before. And they end up mostly in China again, where they originally came from, what makes us twice as much vulnerable. Next, please. From our regulatory point of view, we need more restrictive legislation for the recovery of critical raw materials. It needs to be legislated in terms of quality, not quantity, and of course avoid planned obsolescence. We need to remove legal and administrative barriers for waste to become raw materials, because it is a fact that many companies cannot do industrial symbiosis because of ridiculous administrative barriers. Education at all levels is imperative. We need to move away from the throwaway culture and enhance the use and recycling awareness. Black Friday campaigns and similar enhance consumerism, and the planet will no longer be able to afford this consumerism rate. We need to promote new consumption models and move towards a service economy where the manufacturer is the owner of its product until the end of life. This way, products will be robust, modular, easily disassembled, and recycled.
Just a time reminder, please come to a conclusion.
Yep, I am. And pay attention to the following. reallocation of factories to avoid, please next, to avoid supply shortages, as is being advocated with the semiconductor crisis, might solve the problem in the short term. However, we need to go to the roots to solve the problem in the medium term, and this is a reliable access to raw materials. In this respect, if demand keeps growing, we will need to rely on domestic primary production. And here it comes the NIMBY effect, not in my backyard. I do not want a factory or a mine close to my house because of the impact it creates. So there will be obvious contradictions, such as I still want to renew or acquire new technological devices, but I do not want a mine close to my house. But beware of relegating mining to third countries with low or poor environmental and social standards. Next. So very importantly, the mineral capital in general, any scarce resource, needs to be appropriately valued. Next, imagine that I sell the Tour Eiffel at the price of the steel. That would be 7 million euros. You would say, whoa, this is a ridiculous price for a historic monument. Well, this is exactly what it is being done with the mineral capital. Next. Because the GDP and other economic indicators do not take the effort by nature to produce resources and future generations into account. And the scarcer a resource, the greater the debt we have with nature and with the future generations. Because the mineral capital is a natural heritage of those who live today, but also of those who will be born. And it must be valued fairly in order to create a true sense of conservation and intergenerational justice. Next, in short, avoiding the dependence on fossil fuels will imply to accept the dependence on raw materials. Without materials, there is no energy, but without energy, there are no materials. The solutions are multidimensional and very complex, considering the social problems of mining that come into play. Next. So it is the hour for humanity to begin to adequately manage its non-renewable resources with intelligence and justice. Next. We need an inspiral economy. So thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any doubts, next, you have my email available.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Perhaps if you allow, we would also like to share your presentation with the participants after the event. Thank you very much. Yeah, next up is Juancho López de Uralde, a member of the Spanish Parliament, who's also president of the Ecological Transition Commission of the Spanish Parliament, former director of Greenpeace Spain, and coordinator of Alianza Verde, the Green Alliance. He will tell us about national policies for an ecological transition following the outcomes of the COP26. Again, a reminder, 12 minutes for you.
Muchas gracias por la invitación. Y quería, en primer lugar, pues agradecer el hecho de que hayan convocado esta jornada de reflexión justo después de la COP26, porque muchos y muchas creemos que hay mucho sobre lo que reflexionar y mucho sobre lo que construir a partir de ahora en función de lo que ha ocurrido. Me gustaría, en primer lugar, volver, si ustedes me permiten, un poquito a lo que ha sido la COP26, la reunión de Glasgow, y saber exactamente qué es lo que ha salido bien y qué es lo que ha salido mal. Creo que es muy importante analizar, en primer lugar, lo que ha ocurrido allí para luego extraer conclusiones que podamos aplicar en nuestros países. Antes de comenzar la cumbre había un consenso bastante grande que había 3 elementos que serían los que dictarían el éxito o el fracaso en Glasgow. El primero, lógicamente, si los compromisos de los países alcanzaban o no un nivel de reducción suficiente de las emisiones que pudiera garantizar que no íbamos a superar 1,5 grados centígrados las temperaturas medias por encima de una subida de 1,5 grados sobre niveles preindustriales. El segundo aspecto que considerábamos clave era si se conseguía o no un fondo de solidaridad de 100.000 millones de dólares para la ayuda al desarrollo de la transición energética de los países ricos a los países en desarrollo. Y el tercer elemento era la finalización del libro, del rule book, del libro de ruta del Acuerdo de París. Creo que podemos decir, sin temor a equivocarnos, que el primer elemento, que es el más importante, claramente ha fallado. No ha habido compromisos suficientes que nos garanticen a día de hoy estar mucho más alejados de los 3 grados de aumento de las temperaturas. Estamos en 2,7 según los datos de Naciones Unidas, lo cual hay que considerarlo, sin lugar a dudas, un fracaso colectivo. Ojo, yo no diría tanto un fracaso de las COP, porque para mí el problema no es que una vez al año representantes de 190, de 200 países se reúnan para hablar de cambio climático. Creo que eso es necesario, creo que es positivo. Sin embargo, la cuestión es si se están obteniendo resultados o no y por qué. Y por lo tanto, para mí el cuestionamiento, y en esto creo que hay dos imágenes que resumen el resultado de la COP, para mí, que son determinantes. Y una es la declaración del secretario general de Naciones Unidas, que dijo al final, después del cierre de la COP, hizo una declaración diciendo no hay voluntad política global suficiente. Y creo que esta es la base del fracaso. Creo que esta es una frase que resume el fracaso en el que estamos inmersos. No hay voluntad política global suficiente para hacer frente al cambio climático. Y la segunda imagen, que para mí pues, también fue un buen resumen, fue pues, el momento en el que el presidente de la cumbre prácticamente entre lágrimas pide disculpas por los escasos resultados obtenidos, ¿no? Creo que eso, de alguna manera, es el resumen de lo que ocurrió en Glasgow, ¿no? Al final, ¿qué se hizo? Pues con respecto a los 1,5 grados, con respecto a la ambición, se alargó hasta diciembre de 2022 el plazo para que los países revisen sus compromisos de reducción de emisiones, de tal manera que a ver si en 2022 se alcanza ese compromiso capaz de mantenernos por debajo de 1,5 grados. Bien, esto tiene una doble lectura. Desde mi punto de vista es evidentemente una patada para adelante. Una vez más, retrasamos el compromiso al año que viene. Tiene la lectura positiva, para quien quiera verlo así, de que se da un poquito más de tiempo a ver si los gobiernos reflexionan. Y es ahí donde entra la reflexión que yo quiero hacer hoy, ¿no? Y es que ahora mismo la pelota en gran medida está en el tejado de los parlamentos nacionales, que somos los que podemos, los que tenemos la capacidad de influir, y en esto incluye el Parlamento Europeo, de influir para que realmente la agenda avance. Porque creo que en parte hay un problema en el propio sistema de las COP, que desde mi punto de vista, a partir de la cumbre de Copenhague, donde claramente hubo una fractura con los procesos anteriores, en la cual se rompe algo que es clave y debilita muchísimo los resultados de las COP. Y es que a partir de Copenhague los acuerdos pierden aquello de ser vinculantes. Y creo que sin ser vinculantes es muy débil la fuerza de esos acuerdos, ¿no? Porque uno de los elementos que ha tenido mucha propaganda de la COP26 han sido esos acuerdos, colaterales, ¿no? Sobre cuestiones que son muy relevantes. Por ejemplo, el acuerdo de reducción de las emisiones de metano en un 30% para el año 2030, el acuerdo de salvaguarda de los bosques para el año 2030, el acuerdo que llegaron a algunos países y algunas compañías automovilísticas de terminar con la producción de coches de combustión en el año 2035, o el acuerdo de terminar con la financiación de plantas de combustibles fósiles en terceros países, ¿no? Estos acuerdos son importantes, es decir, contienen compromisos importantes. Es verdad que pues, tienen limitaciones. Por ejemplo, no se entiende muy bien por qué acordamos una reducción de las emisiones de metano del 30% para 2030, cuando en realidad tenemos la capacidad tecnológica para ir mucho más allá de ese 30%, ¿no? Podría estar en el 50%. Pero en todo caso, más allá de cada uno de los elementos de cada acuerdo, lo cierto es que estos acuerdos deben ser utilizados, desde mi punto de vista, como herramientas por parte de los movimientos sociales, por parte de los parlamentos nacionales, para hacer presión a los gobiernos para que esos acuerdos no se queden simplemente en papel mojado. Porque el hecho de que no sean vinculantes no quita que los gobiernos, que esos gobiernos firmantes, hayan firmado acuerdos, hayan firmado compromisos a través por los cuales, por ejemplo, se comprometen a la eliminación de la destrucción de los bosques, ¿no? Uno de los firmantes del acuerdo de destrucción de los bosques ha sido Bolsonaro. Esto, evidentemente, le quita mucha credibilidad a ese acuerdo, porque, evidentemente, dices, bueno, si Bolsonaro lo ha firmado, debe ser que el acuerdo no va mucho más allá. Claro, porque él sabe que nadie le va a exigir cuentas por ello, ¿no? Pero, sin embargo, yo creo que los movimientos sociales sí deben hacer bandera de estos acuerdos y sí deben exigir y debemos exigir en los parlamentos nacionales que estos acuerdos se conviertan en leyes y que estos acuerdos finalmente impulsen acciones concretas y acciones específicas en cada uno de los aspectos que se mencionan, ¿no? Por eso yo creo que tenemos que convertir las debilidades de la COP26 en fortalezas, porque hay mucho a lo que podemos agarrarnos de lo que ha ocurrido en la COP, sin obviar que se han quedado muchas cosas en el camino, que se han quedado muchas cosas a la mitad, pero sin embargo yo creo que no podemos caer en el error de pensar que lo que ha ocurrido no sirve para nada. Y la prueba de que importa es el interés que pusieron los lobbies de los combustibles fósiles para que no se avanzara. En la principal delegación en la COP26, la delegación más numerosa en Glasgow era la delegación de la industria de los combustibles fósiles. Tenían más de 500 representantes en muy distintos papeles y en muy distintos roles, pero tenían más de 500 representantes allí, más que cualquier país. Creo que esto nos da una idea. El hecho de que, si ustedes siguieron las negociaciones, el hecho de que en el plenario final, a última hora, todavía el lobby del carbón estuviera presionando para eliminar el lenguaje que hablaba de eliminación del carbón, y esto creo que fue un enorme fracaso desde mi punto de vista de última hora, cómo se eliminó esa lengua de terminar con el carbón, cambiándola por pues una reducción, ¿no?, de su utilización, pero muestra hasta qué punto los lobbies interesados en que nada cambie están ahí y están presionando en cada línea y en cada lugar para que no haya un lenguaje suficientemente fuerte, ¿no? Por lo tanto, yo creo que tenemos que por eso, coger las partes que realmente pues, son interesantes, que las hay, los compromisos, porque la reiteración del compromiso de 1,5 grados, ojo, la reiteración del compromiso de 1,5 grados es más sólida que el lenguaje del Acuerdo de París. El Acuerdo de París hablaba evitar un calentamiento entre 1,5 y 2 grados. Ahora se está hablando mantenerlo por debajo de 1,5 grados, ¿no? Por lo tanto, tenemos que utilizar estas herramientas que la cumbre de Glasgow nos ha dado, por supuesto haciendo un análisis tremendamente crítico de lo que ha ocurrido y siendo conscientes de que el proceso va mucho más lento de lo necesario, que estamos en una emergencia climática, que los gobiernos no están respondiendo, que, como he dicho, no hay suficiente voluntad, pero creo que tenemos que recoger las partes que son interesantes. Otra cuestión que no quiero dejar de comentar es, y que produce una enorme alerta, es la utilización de ciertos lobbies de este proceso para su beneficio, ¿no? Industrias que son peligrosas, como por ejemplo la industria del gas o la industria nuclear, están utilizando el proceso contra el cambio climático para tratar de que en la Unión Europea se les considere industrias sostenibles, ¿no? Y no lo son, y creo que hay que decirlo muy claramente, ¿no? Los lobbies del gas y el lobby nuclear están especialmente activos porque ven en la lucha contra el cambio climático una oportunidad para revitalizar sus industrias. Y yo creo que, al contrario, precisamente lo único que puede realmente sacarnos del proceso de degradación climática en el que estamos inmersos son las energías renovables, como se ha dicho antes, ¿no? Por lo tanto, creo que no debemos caer en la tentación de coger la mano de estos falsos amigos que realmente lo único que quieren es que estas industrias pervivan, ¿no? Pero bueno, en definitiva, y con esto termino, quiero recordar que solamente de todos los países que había en Glasgow, solamente 8 países llevaban sus compromisos de reducción de emisiones en una ley nacional. Por lo tanto, creo que queda muchísimo camino por recorrer. Creo que la lucha contra el cambio climático no puede quedarse solamente en las cumbres mundiales, en las COP. Creo que si luego, cuando se vuelve a los países, a las regiones, a los municipios, todo eso que se ha hablado no se convierte en acción real y concreta, en legislación real y concreta, en medidas reales y concretas, desde el nivel local al nivel nacional, realmente servirán para poco. Y ese es el reto, ¿no? Lo que ha ocurrido en Glasgow podemos utilizarlo en favor de la lucha contra el cambio climático y seguir avanzando. Y creo que no hay espacio para el derrotismo, porque la gente lo que necesita es esperanza, necesita ver que hay luz al final del túnel. Y eso es lo que yo creo que nosotros, responsables públicos, tenemos que transmitir. Tenemos que transmitir que hay esperanza, que podemos salir del lío, pero tenemos que hacerlo realmente con una decisión política mucho mayor de la que en este momento hay. Y vuelvo y termino con la frase del secretario general de Naciones Unidas. Lo que hemos visto en Glasgow es que no hay voluntad política global suficiente para hacer frente al cambio climático. Muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much. And indeed, you mentioned a very important point about fossil fuels as well, which, of course, our investment choices are crucial, which takes us to our next speaker, Benoît Lallemand, Secretary General of Finance Watch, who will tell us about sustainable finance post COP26 and what needs to happen to make it a reality.
Mr. Lallemand, you can press the speak button once, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, thank you.
Yes? Okay. So I'm Benoît Lallemand. I'm the Secretary General of Finance Watch. Finance Watch is a non-profit association created after the crisis of 2007, 2008 to provide a counterweight to the financial lobby. So we represent the voice of European citizens in the reform of the financial system. We have 110 members in 20 countries. Now, let me take a step back and look at the role of finance in a just and green transition. Finance is an enabler. So if you like, it's a servant, or it should be a servant. It's not an end in itself. So other speakers have talked about the actual ends and the focus on the changes we need to see. So what we need is to transform the economy with a double objective, as we heard, removing inequality on the one hand and basically removing CO2 emissions, but also minerals use, as was discussed. Thus, even before we talk about finance, what we need is a plan to transform our economy. And that plan needs to come from governments as they have the democratic legitimacy to do so. Now, the elephant is the room, as we just heard, in general, and as illustrated by COP26, is that our leaders do not have a vision for society, and certainly they do not have a concrete plan to transform our economies. I'll come back to that. Now, how can finance help with a green and just transformation or transition? Finance or sustainable finance is usually understood almost by default as private finance. And then the question is, how can banks, insurers, capital markets help? And that is because we are still thinking within a neoliberal paradigm. Finance, or the financial system, is if you think about it, and again, take a step back, is composed of three pillars. One pillar is fiscal policy, and which is government spending and investments. A second pillar is monetary policy, which is managing the supply of money, money creation. And then the third pillar is financial regulation, which is the role of private finance. Now, over the last 3 or 4 decades, mainstream politics have put financial markets and private finance at the center of everything, or in the driving seat, with government finance being constrained to the minimum, so-called austerity, but also supporting financial markets, and monetary policy also supporting financial markets. So I can respond immediately to the question what needs to happen next. It is for fiscal policy, governments, public finance to take the lead with monetary policy and financial markets at the service of government policy. Fiscal policy, together with taxation and economic regulation, needs to be in the driving seat. It needs to be ambitious in the quantities of spending and investment, and crucially, as we heard, it has to deliver a green and just transition that is the qualitative aspect of fiscal policy. And finally, it needs to be democratic. So we need, again, governments and politicians to be accountable of their decisions and what they do or not do. Then monetary policy, as I said, needs to be at the service of fiscal policy and supporting governments, and private finance needs to be regulated in such a way that it supports a green and just transition. Now that I have explained what needs to happen, I have good and bad news before I come to the conclusion. The main good news is, if I can be ironic, COVID. Thanks to COVID, we have seen a big return of fiscal policy and the role of governments, and a few myths have been destroyed in the process. The first myth was that there is no magic monetary. Of course, there is a magic monetary, and central banks can create money at will. The second myth is that governments cannot impose changes on the economy or on citizens, and of course they can. They stopped the whole economy, they forced planes to stay on the ground, and they forced citizens to stay in their living room, even forbidding them to go outside their home. And I must say citizens have been quite docile in the process, and certainly markets have been very docile as well. Another myth was that governments cannot go into more depth, and that the ratio of public debt to GDP has to be limited at 60%, the Maastricht criteria. Of course, we've seen that is totally wrong. 60% is very arbitrary, and in fact today the average is more like 100% in Europe, and everything is well. Another myth is that financial markets can drive the economy, and markets in general will save the planet and make people happy. Of course, that's not the case. An economy driven by private finance, by markets in general, has no direction. It is focused on short-term profit at the expense of everything else. And I could go on with how actually the COVID crisis could accelerate a change of paradigm. Quickly, the other good news is that reforms are on the table in Brussels to make this change happen. There's a review of the rules around public finance, so-called review of the economic governance, and there's a review of the rules on private finance for insurers, for banks. There's also sustainable finance rules. I cannot detail them now. Members of the Parliament will be well aware, and please check our website to look at all the details around these rules, which basically could make the change of paradigm become law in the EU. So there's a huge opportunity. Now to the bad news quickly. And as evidenced by the results of COP26, as I said, governments do not have a plan to embrace the change of paradigm and deliver a green and just transition. In fact, worse, they are rushing us back to normal. And that doesn't make sense. COVID is seen as an external event, independent from the way we organize society and the economy, a bit like an asteroid that struck the Earth. And on the contrary, scientists tell us that the heart of the problem, in fact, the cause of increased frequency and severity of pandemics, is the way we produce and consume. That is, in other words, COVID is a direct result of the way we organize society and the economy. And so then the second bad news, and I'm coming to a conclusion, is that governments still count on the private sector, financial markets in general, to save the day. A lot of the public money which is being spent in reaction to COVID in the EU, in the US by Biden, is actually going directly to large multinationals without a related increase in regulation. When it comes to public finance, again, the bad news is that politicians, the Council in particular, with the Commission, do not have a lot of ambition to democratize the use of public finance and to direct the quantities of money into a green and just transition. With private finance rules on insurance, on banks, unfortunately it's the case, we see weak proposals, basically dictated by the Council. So we can really hope that the Parliament in the EU, but also national parliaments, will rectify this and support our efforts as Finance Watch and with citizens supporting us to change the rules of public finance and private finance to put all of that at the service of the transition. My conclusion is we know what we need to do, we know the challenge, and as I said, we have legislative opportunities on the table, so I think we should join forces and make that change happen. I'm totally convinced that we have the support of a majority of European citizens, and I'll leave it there. I'll thank you for your time. And please reach out to myself or to my colleagues if you have any question or if you want to have a discussion. Have a good conference.
Yes, thank you very much. Next up will be Henriette Prast, who is a member of the Dutch Senate for the Party of the Animals, for the Animals, excuse me. And she will tell us about plant-based transition in the food system. And yeah, the floor is yours. You have 12 minutes.
Thank you. Please show my first slide. Yes. I'm here with a proposal for policymakers or for people who can influence reality. And I called it Carnist, Put Yourself on the List. I'm also a professor of Tilburg University, and actually this is something I'm in behavioral economics, and it's an idea I developed based on, next slide, based on the work of two American professors, Richard Thaler, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics, and Cass Sunstein, who is the most cited law professor in the world. And in their work, and has been put together in this book, which is written for lay people, so not in a academic frame. The main conclusion is how a choice is presented influences what people choose. And that means that you are never neutral in the way you present choices. And that is, of course, used by the commercial industry in marketing, not in the interest of the consumer or the citizen, but in the interest of sales and profit. But that's not what the book is about. The book is about how can you use those insights in social marketing, in presenting choices in a way that either enhances people's individual well-being or well-being of society as a whole. Next. Here you see one of the authors, Cass Sunstein. He was an important advisor to Barack Obama, and he made sure that in an executive order of Obama, the word default rules was introduced. So, and here you see them together laughing. Why? Because based on this executive order, one new rule was introduced, and that said that if families have the right to free school meals because they are vulnerable, because they have a very low income, because they are fragile, you use them, you present those choices, free school meals, not based on whether parents ask for it. That was the old system. If you didn't ask, if you kept your mouth shut, your child didn't get free school meals, but the other way around. As the government exactly knew which children were eligible for a free school meal, the child got it unless the parent objected. And that resulted in millions more children of poor families with a free school meal, a free healthy school meal. Next. So then I thought, well, if the way a choice is presented is so influential in what people choose, because in general, whether it's pension choice, anything, people go for the default for what you choose when you do nothing, when you do not take explicit action. Around 80% of people are guided by the default choice, the choice you take when you don't do anything. And here is an example, and I thought maybe we can use that to promote plant-based food. And so here you see the World Conference on Climate Change. That's a conference, I think, always in the United States, and you see it here in 2009 and 2008. In 2008, the attendees of the conference, if they wanted a vegetarian lunch and dinner, they needed to specify that, so they needed to take action. In other words, the default was meat or fish, or meat and fish. And in 2009, the organizers of the conference decided to change it, that if you wanted to have meat and or fish, you had to notify the organizers in advance. So the same as a year before vegetarians had to do. And you see the enormous effect on what people actually chose. Next slide, please. Why is this effect so powerful? Why does the way you, the silent choice, the silent consent choice affects so much what people choose? Well, people don't have to make the effort, that's one thing. These are not different conflicting explanations, they add up to the effect. People forget to inform organizers of the different choice. There's a social norm because, well, usually the silent choice, the default choice, is what most people choose. And it has some kind of psychological cost to deviate from what others do. And I think I made that bold for a reason. The default is perceived by people as the recommended choice. And that has ethical implications, I think, on top of practical implications for policymakers. Because if you, well, to take this specific example, if you, as European Parliament, European Commission, whatever a public institution, ask vegetarians and vegans to take action instead of asking people who would like to take action, you push people in a direction. So you can never be neutral. So next slide, please. In 2010 or 11, I proposed to make a vegetarian the default choice. I did that on a conference. Sorry, these texts are all in Dutch, but it's because I took it from newspapers to show you how much time it has taken to have this idea developed in practice, but that it has been applied in practice. So first, universities started to say, if we organize dinners and lunches, people need to ask if they want meat or fish. So we offer it, we don't forbid it or whatever, but they need to inform us, just as previously vegans and vegetarians had to do. Then the city of Amsterdam did it, then other universities did it, the city of Rotterdam, and so on. So these are all examples, and there are more that can be added. So this is what I labeled, translated into English, Carnist, put yourself on the list. Our party in the Netherlands has made an animation film of it. I will send it to the organizers so you can watch it at home if you would like to. Next, please. Just a few words, because I don't know whether there's as much awareness as in my party, in your group. Why is it so important for policymakers to make this change, to change the default? Avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on Earth, and that was published in the top academic journal, Science. I will not read all of it, but this is the conclusion. Next. This is work of Arjen Hoekstra, who sadly passed away last year at a very young age. I think he was like 50 or maybe even younger, Anja. And he was the leader of the water management research group at one of our universities. And here you see what he found out. about the use of households in the Netherlands of water. And what you see is that domestic water use, the water you see or you hear streaming when you brush your teeth, when you do the laundry, etc., is only 2% of all the water we use. The other 98% is in what we consume, because for producing what we consume, a lot of water is needed. And you see that 31% comes from meat consumption, because for meat consumption, you need animals. In order to have animals, you need to feed them. In order to feed them, you need to grow food. In order to grow food, you need water. And it's a very inefficient way of feeding people, because there would be much more food if the land we use for growing animal food was used for growing human food for humans. Next, please. One additional reason why it is very important to reduce our consumption of animal proteins is that the rising consumption of these proteins and the intensification of agriculture, and as a result of demand for animal-based foods, is listed among the 7 major causes of zoonotic disease emergence. That was already known, but it was not picked up by politicians before COVID-19. And I'm very sorry to say that, at least in my country, it still is not picked up by politicians. Yesterday we had the annual budget debate in the Senate, and no euro is going to preventing zoonotic diseases in the future. The politicians seem to think this was a one-time exogenic shock. Next. Yes. So, key message: not introducing a plant-based default for organized meals implies that you are nudging people, slightly pushing them towards meat and other animal protein consumption. So you are not neutral. You are pushing in what I consider the wrong direction. And a plant-based default does not reduce individuals' freedom of choice. I think this was my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up is Kaisa Reetta Koskinen, Head of Climate Unit and Project Director, Carbon Neutral Helsinki. She will tell us more about the role that cities will play at COP26, or played at COP26, and what cities must do next. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you hear me fine. So I basically have a title with 2 topics. And it's a little bit problematic topic for me, because the first part, the role of cities at COP26, I basically know nothing. And the other part of the topic, what cities must do next, I know quite a lot. And I was a little bit confused when I started to preparing for this presentation, because, I was, wondering how I'm able to combine these 2 and what is like a bridge between these 2. And then I realized that I have a mantra or a slogan I am using a lot. And it's that kind of, one slogan fits all kind of thing. I repeat it every time, I give a presentation, and I realized that it does a job again. So because, with that a slogan or that mantra, I can explain and combine these 2. So let's see if I'm able to do it. And the slogan is something my friend told me or said to me about 10 years ago. He said to me, and he told me that the emission reductions are consequences of actions which reduce emissions. So basically he was saying that, when you reduce emissions, emissions are reducing. And during that time, I laughed a lot because I thought that it's quite obvious. It was quite funny to me. And I thought that maybe he is just, joking. But, I've been working with the climate and energy things more than 20 years already. And little by little, I realized that actually there is a very, very big wisdom, an important wisdom in this sentence. And that's why I nominated it to be my mantra. I repeat it every day. And I think that this idea of, actions which reduce emissions, it's very important when we think about the COP26 or any COP negotiations so far. Because what this mantra or this slogan is saying that, maybe we are expecting a little bit too much from those COP negotiations. I have a little bit that kind of feeling that, we are expecting a silver bullet coming from the negotiations and the silver bullet which will solve everything. And I think that it's too much to be expected. Because what the mantra is saying, only actions which reduce emissions are reducing emissions. Negotiations are not reducing emissions. Roadmaps are not reducing emissions. Plans or the commitments, they are not reducing emissions. Only actions which reduce emissions are actually reducing emissions. And that's now we are going on the other part of the title I had. Because what cities and countries and EU and everybody must do next, we must do actions which reduce emissions. And focus on really on those concrete emission reductions. And then I have, what we must do next. The other thing I want to tell you is I learned it when I was a teenager, and I called that time my punk university. And it's probably the most important lesson I have ever learned in my life. And it was 3 letters, DIU, do it yourself. So we have to do actions which reduce emissions, and we have to do it by ourselves. And this is, something I have, applied as a project director of Carbon Neutral Helsinki and a head of climate unit here in a city. And City of Helsinki, we have set a very ambitious carbon neutrality target. The old target was that we wanted to be a carbon neutral by 2035, but during last summer we had a new council election, and the new regime, they updated the target. So now we want to be a carbon neutral by 2030 and zero carbon by 2040. So it means that we have less than 10 years to achieve a carbon neutrality. So we are really in a hurry, and we have to focus on the big things. And that's, one of the things what we have to do next. We must focus on big things. And in Helsinki, the heating is almost 60% of direct emissions. And that's why, we have, during last couple of years, we have focused very much on emissions. So, for example, the city of Helsinki owns about 20% of the buildings inside Helsinki. So they are residential buildings, schools, kindergartens, swimming halls, libraries, hospitals, buildings like that. And we decided that, okay, we put very ambitious energy efficiency requirements for those buildings. So every time when we build something in Helsinki, it has to be at least 20% more energy efficient than what a national code is requiring. And actually, I want to tell you an example what happened to us when we set this goal, because less than 5 months after this goal was, or this requirement was set, the builders, the construction people, they came to me and they told that actually you can make it, you can raise the bar already. So 20, we can do 20 easily, so we can put the bar on to 30%. So at the moment when we build something, it's 30%, 1/3 more energy efficient than the national code is requiring. And it does not cost a lot, because especially when the price of the energy is very expensive, the energy efficiency actually pays back. And when the energy is very expensive, it pays back faster. So it has been very easy to justify. And it's my advice, especially when you don't have a lot of money, then you should focus on energy efficiency. We are regulating energy efficiency on land lease agreements. We are putting energy efficiency requirements on city plans. We are making the permitting process for renewable energy easy. So, for example, we don't get any money, we don't put any fee on geothermal permits. We are making PV solar permits easier. You don't need to get a permit, you just give a notice to city. We are trying to make that easier and easier. Also, in public procurements, we are trying to make the decision which are reducing emissions. For example, at the moment we are trying to set public procurement criteria for less carbon concretes for the infra projects. Of course, City of Helsinki does not own all the buildings, only 20%, and the rest is owned mainly by private people through housing associations. And energy renovations in Helsinki, they make a lot of sense. They make economical sense, and probably first time in history, money is not the bottleneck. And we were really worried that, and really, that kind of, surprised that why don't we see energy renovation wave here in Helsinki, because, it makes economical sense. So you are able to save money by doing energy renovations. And we studied it and we learned that energy renovations, they are very difficult for normal people, for lay people. And we wanted to help them. And that's why we hired a team of engineers. So at the moment we have 10 trained engineers working for the City of Helsinki. And their only job is to help private housing association to run through energy renovations. For example, to change to geothermal and increasing insulation and things like that. It's of course it's not enough, and of course sometimes we don't know by ourselves what we should do. At the moment, 90% of buildings in Helsinki, they are connected to the district heat system, and almost 90% of the district heat is still produced by burning fossil fuels. And I'm not very proud of that, and it's really that kind of a big problem, a big challenge for us how to handle and how to change, how to get rid of fossil fuels. And because it is such a complex and a big problem, we asked help. So a little bit more than 1.5 years ago, we launched a competition, a challenge competition. We asked everybody to come and help us. And the prize was €1 million, and we got 252 different kind of proposals, how we are able to decarbonize our heating system without burning biomass, because we think that the biomass is not a sustainable solution in the long run. At the moment, based on that competition, we are preparing a roadmap for carbon neutral heating for a city. And also that process had been done in co-creation phase. So we asked the best energy expert in Finland to come and work with us and really to contribute to make sure that we have the best available roadmap, what to do next. The city of Helsinki, by the way, is owner of the energy company, so that's why we have many things we can do there. Also, we are preparing a local heating networks, heated with a geothermal and with a low network temperature and things like that. So we have many engineering things ongoing, how we are trying to reduce the emissions from the heating. Those are just some examples what cities can do, what we are doing in Helsinki. Of course, you know, every cities, they have a different kind of challenges and they have a different kind of opportunities. But I think that it's most important thing is to start do something and you know, do it by yourself. You know, not waiting a silver bullet, but using those tools and those measures which are available, which are in your hands at the moment. The journalists, they often come to me and they want to see something. They want me to show them something. You know, they are asking that how does a climate fight looks like, and I used to always take them to construction site, and I think that, you know, it's a very good metaphor of fights, a global climate change fight. So what we must do next, it looks very much like a construction site. It looks like energy renovation. It looks like a solar PVs. It looks like updated terms of land lease and new priorities on the city plans. It looks like a targets for energy efficiency for schools and kindergartens. Actually, it looks very much like work we do every day in the cities. It looks like the work we do every day, but with emission reduction targets integrated into that work. And I think I'm overrunning my time, but, you know, at the beginning I told you about the Helsinki targets, and I told you that, you know, we have a very steep reduction curve ahead of us, that we have to do a lot and we have to do it very fast. But there is also, you know, a different kind of integration, and I think that, you know, we also need a hope, and we need that kind of, you know, the thing that we are able to do this. And that's why, you know, we can also, in the case of Helsinki, we can do a different kind of integration, because we have cut our emissions already 33%. So we have already reduced 1/3 of the emissions. And I can tell you that, you know, the lifestyle here in Helsinki, it's or the quality of life, it's not worse than what it was 30 years ago. So we have proved, we have a track record, we have shown already that we are able to do it and to keep the lifestyle and the life, you know, quality of life. So it's just that we have to, you know, to focus on the actions which reduce emissions, and we have to do it by ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all the speakers for your discipline in keeping the time. I will hand the floor now to Silvia Modig, who will wrap up the discussion and tie everything together that we just heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank all our guests and our speakers. Thank you for being available for us, and thank you for your really interesting and thought-provoking presentations. All of your topics would deserve a discussion of their own, but put together like this, I think this gives a clear picture of how comprehensive the system change has to be, how it has to be on all levels, whether it's municipality, whether it's national parliament, European Parliament. whether it's our actions abroad European borders that we affect as the choices we do as consumers. And I think this was a really good set because the discussion in our societies regarding climate, I think it's really polarized at the moment. In one hand, you have the activists demanding more ambitious decisions and getting really, really frustrated. Then you have some countries, some companies who still try to stick to the old world. They still try to stick to their fossil capitalism revenues without understanding that the train has already passed them. And some people fear for the tomorrow. They fear that will this transition lead to me losing my job? Will this lead to the expenses of warming our apartment be too high? Will I be able to take my children to school because I need a card? And then there are some political forces who use these fears for their political gain. And what we as the left must be able to do is to provide a positive vision of the future, to show that this transition is possible, and it is possible to do in a just way so that nobody will get left behind. As Henriette's presentation inspired me, in a way we have to change the default settings, not only in our system, but also in people's minds, to see and to present them a positive visions that this can be done in a way that our life, it will change, but it will change in a good way. So in this work, you all inspired us a lot, so I want to thank you very much. And this brings us to the end of the first panel, and I would at this point like to give the floor to my colleague Anja Hazekamp to present the second panel. Thank you.
So I would like to thank Silvia Modig and thank you all for being here. And a huge thank you to the very interesting speakers in the first panel. You made it clear that we desperately need an ecological transition, an ecological revolution even, including a food revolution. And we've heard about some essential building blocks for this. We want, with a lot of great examples, but I have to say the plant-based by default initiative being one topic you can understand is very close to my heart. Just transition needs to incorporate justice for all living creatures, and a transition to a sustainable, ethical and healthy agriculture needs to be at its core, but it is sadly so very often still missing from the climate debate. And in the COP26 and in the discussions in the European Common Agricultural Policy, the crucial solutions such as reducing livestock numbers are still taboo. It is the big cow in the room, and we still rely on techno-fixes instead of the system changes that will bring us nowhere. And this is one of the many reasons that I have tabled a rejection amendment against the CAP strategic plans, supported with by many colleagues from the left, and thank you for that. But our political actions are nothing without help and input from the whole society. Scientists, activists, citizens are crucial to bring about the much needed changes in our society. And our next panel concerns another crucial topic for a just ecological revolution: organizing and activism. And I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm very proud of the legal actions we've seen on climate in my country. The Urgenda Foundation, which sadly could not participate today, they won a landmark victory in the High Court against the failing climate policy of my government. And also crucially, a historical court ruling against Shell, ordered Shell to cut back its emissions. And these cases have inspired environmental defenders from all over the world to turn to legal action. And I'm sure we will hear more inspiration in this coming panel. I would like to give the floor to my colleague Malin Björk from the Swedish Left Party to introduce the speakers of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja, and very welcome to this second panel, which I have the pleasure to moderate. And from the Swedish Left Party, we have been engaged in actions against climate change since we started to work here in the European Parliament. And we will be able to meet one of my colleagues as last panel speaker here as well. And I was myself in Glasgow, and it was remarkable, the mobilization, because I was there during the days where there was the citizens' mobilization, the People's Summit. And that says something about the organizing activism, I think, in the post-COP26 era that we are now in, and where we need to put the emphasis. And I come also from Sweden. You know that Greta Thunberg started a global movement, and she's certainly not alone. Millions of young people are taking to the streets, and they are making themselves heard. And when we work in this room, inside these parliamentary spaces, it is very clear that those voices have to be carried into these spaces. And that is our job, I think, in the left, to be one of the bridges. So we have some fantastic speakers in this second panel. We have, the first one is Carolina Santos from Portugal, and she will speak about the student strikes in Portugal and the role of strikes in affecting change on climate policy. And this is part of the youth activism that we are seeing around here. And Carolina, you are on remote connection, so the screen is yours if you're ready. And you have to...
Mrs. Santos, press the speak button, please.
Yeah, press the speak button. We can see your name on the screen, but we can't see you and we can't hear you. Yeah. We are trying to refresh your connection. So we wait for another 30 seconds, and if not, we will move on to second panel speaker. This happens all the time. She has lost the connection. Okay. You know what? Let's give Carolina Santos some time to get connected again and test her connection with the technical people here. So I will then move on to Silvia Pastorelli. climate and energy campaigner for Greenpeace, and you're here in person. That's very nice also, of course, and you will be speaking about changing mindsets to change the system. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Actually, 2 years ago, I was invited to speak on a similar panel about COP25 and the urgency to agree on an international deal that would keep the 1.5 objective of the Paris Agreement real and tangible was there then as it is today. In the time between then and now, millions of people, as you just said, have taken to the streets, especially young people, to make their voices heard. I think at one point in time we had roughly 6 million people on the streets marching for climate. So the awareness of the climate emergency has never been as high as it is today. Also, we know that after 2 years of pandemic, despite 2 years of pandemic, as a recent Eurobarometer survey says, climate change is considered by the majority of EU citizens as the most serious problem facing the world right now. At the same time, this summer we have seen more floods, more fires, more storms, and all these things are reminding us that the climate crisis is not just on our doorstep anymore. It's inside our house, and it is making itself very comfortable. And yet, we are not on track to reach our climate objectives. Or, more accurately, the climate objectives themselves are falling short of what is required by science. But we also know something else, and I'm going to give you some figures here, so please bear with me. There's a bit of numbers, but they're there for a reason. We also know that just 100 companies have been the source of more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions since the year I was born, and that was 1988. Maybe some of you might think that I'm very young, and that's not a long time ago, so let's go further back. We also know that only 20 companies are behind a third of all carbon emissions since the year the Beatles released Help. That was 1965, so that's a little bit longer back. Coming back to today, research from Global Witness, Corporate Accountability, Glasgow Call Out Polluters, and Corporate Europe Observatory revealed that at least 503 fossil fuel lobbyists were admitted at the climate talks in Glasgow. And that's a number bigger than any country delegation who was present there. I mentioned the emissions, I've mentioned the companies, I've mentioned their army of lobbyists. Let's talk about money. Between 2010 and 2018, the top 5 fossil fuel companies, Shell, BP, Total, Chevron, Exxon, and their lobby groups have spent at least €250 million on lobbying in Europe. Lobbying that takes different forms and shapes. It's not always just meetings or sitting across the table. It's also events like the one happening today in parallel to this debate. That's the European Business Summit, which is sponsored by ExxonMobil and Japan Tobacco International, but that's a different story. Sponsoring high-profile events such as this, the same as fossil fuel-sponsored media events, buys the fossil fuel industry a platform to gain credibility and influence, especially in the eyes of decision makers like you. Often it's done in subtle ways, like trying to reframe the conversation. Other times they make no mystery about it. And that's also the case of the European Business Summit. So I'm going to read you something directly from the website. The European Business Summit partners get the opportunity to influence the EU decision-making process by bringing their expertise, priorities, and expectations to the attention of a diverse and influential audience, including EU representatives. They also stress on their website, this is all there, you can look it up, that they offer unique networking moments, such as lunches and dinners with business leaders, and private sessions and meetings with key decision makers to allow the partners to reach their goals. This is word for word. Again, one of the main partners of this event is Exxon. And tomorrow, Commissioner for Energy Kadri Simpson will sit on a panel to talk about EU energy mix with representatives of the fossil fuel industry, including Exxon President for Europe. So with this kind of sponsorship, the fossil fuel industry has been able to buy social license which is something that they should have run out of a long time ago, considering their track record on the climate crisis. And this social license is priceless. So, is it really a surprise then that we keep falling short of our climate objectives? Is it really a surprise that in 2021 in climate negotiations, what we get in the text is a mere reference to a coal phase down rather than a coal phase out? Or is it a surprise that the EU, despite its commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, still doesn't have a concrete plan on how to do it? A big part of this comes also from the fact that fossil fuel presence is so rooted in our society that to weed it out seems unthinkable. The presence is invasive and it is pervasive. Fossil fuel companies are at the station when you catch your train home. They're there on a billboard that greenwashes their dirty business with their 2% investment in renewables. They are on your Twitter feeds promoting their offsetting schemes through paid advertisement. They're also in our universities, like at a symposium taking place in Leuven next week, where another fossil fuel companies will be given a platform to greenwash the track record on climate denial. They're also present in our leisure time at sports events like the Euros or cultural institutions like museums and galleries. So now let's think again about those figures that I have mentioned. We know exactly who is primarily responsible for the climate crisis. These companies have names, they have addresses, we know who they are. Fossil fuel companies' social license, their legitimacy should be, by now, should be expired currency, as their activities are fueling the climate emergency. So this is why it is essential to challenge what's acceptable and change mindsets. And that won't happen without activism and organizing. Right now, Greenpeace and other 20 organizations are using a European citizen initiative to call for a ban on all advertisement and sponsorship by fossil fuel companies, car makers, airlines, to do exactly that and to challenge the notion that these companies have any right to be part of our public life or our political life. Looking at this COP, but also at EU processes where more fossil gas infrastructure will be eligible for public funding, fossil gas might be labeled as a sustainable activity. Offsets are considered as a legitimate substitute for real emission cuts. So it's clear that it will be organizing and activism that will deliver the results, not these things, at least until those responsible for the problems will be allowed to portray themselves as the holders of the solution. Years ago, we had been faced with a similar problem. We had a product, tobacco, that we knew was harmful and the direct cause of a health crisis. So we decided that it was only logical to ban this the promotion of this product through its advertisement. And now, once again, we are faced with a very similar situation. We know that we have a product that is dangerous, that it's toxic. We know that this product is at the roots of our changing climate. So why should we continue to allow its promotion through advertisement, through sponsorship? And why should we continue these companies to, why should we allow these companies to continue greenwash their activities, to pollute our environments, and to pollute our politics? So it's with initiatives like this, like the CCI, that activists are challenging what is acceptable, and they're taking the unthinkable, and they're making it inevitable. And it's only when this shift in mindset happens that we can truly envision a system change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Yeah, indeed, very interesting setup there. One feels like going over and you know, ruining the party at that business summit. But we have things to do and work to get done here. And I will go back to Carolina Santos from Portugal, student striker. Are you with us now? How is your connection?
Mrs. Santos, can you please press once the speak button at the bottom? Thank you very much. We can see you. Can you say, we can't hear you, unfortunately. In case you have a headset around, or if you have a headset plugged in, you can unplug it. We can't hear you, unfortunately, Mrs. Santos. We will call you to guide you how to change the settings.
Okay, so we're almost there, Carolina. Now at least we saw you, so next time we will also hear you, I'm sure. I will move on in the panel to the next participant. It's Linda Siegele, who's a lawyer and will speak to us about organizing on adaptation and loss and damage, how to effectively advocate for fairness and equity. And as we know, this was one of the most difficult points at the COP26, and one of the points also where civil society and the youth mobilization and all the mobilizations around have been very, very strong. So we're very much looking forward to hear from you. And you're also with us remote. So please, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can hear
maybe
you,
turn
but
up
it
the
is very
sound
low.
from our side.
Okay. I have a presentation. If it's not, yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you to the organizers for...
Excuse me, Mr. Siegel, can you maybe put the microphone a little away?
Away?
No, yeah, just and a little lower, maybe.
A little lower.
Yeah,
Okay.
like this. Thank you.
Is this good?
Yes, it's good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Despite my accent, I am actually a British citizen. I'm based at University College London. I'm an academic lawyer, and I have been supporting the Alliance of Small Island States in the UNFCCC process on adaptation and loss and damage since 2005. So I have a long history in the international process around this. And I know I'm here in an activist sort of fora, but what I'd like to do with this presentation is try and provide some highlights of what happened around adaptation and loss and damage at COP26, CMA3, and provide hopefully some guideposts to those activists who are willing to support the most vulnerable countries in this process. If we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So just an outline, and this will be very, very quick. It's almost like a speed dating, this event, and I love it. It's great. So many amazing speakers. I want to talk about fairness and equity very briefly around adaptation and loss and damage. What does that mean? Looking at some of the COP26 CMA3 outcomes on adaptation and loss and damage, and providing, as I said, some signposts or guideposts for those advocates and activists. And I know there will be others following me who are much more involved in the grassroots activism arena to provide some signposts for them in the next year. Next slide, please. So just very simply looking at fairness and equity when it comes to adaptation to the impacts of climate change and loss and damage associated with those impacts, in particular when adaptation isn't enough. So I really divided it into two spaces. One is the intragenerational equity space, those least responsible for climate change impacts, in other words, developing countries, especially the poorest and the geographically vulnerable, are most affected by those impacts. And yet they also depend on those who are responsible for providing or for causing those impacts to provide them with the finance which is required to address those impacts, the technologies required to address those impacts, and the capacity building to be able to address those impacts. So we have a world that's broken in two. Those who've been responsible for causing the impacts and those who are suffering them. And quite often there's a wide divide between those. But there's also intergenerational equity, and I think this is a critically important aspect because climate change is a long-term problem. It's a problem that manifests itself over the long term, which means that those who are saddled with resolving the problem are not necessarily those who are in the decision-making seat for resolving them. And I think that's equally as critical for us, especially in this activist arena that we are in right now. Okay, next slide, please. So very briefly, these are highlights. These are not all of the outcomes on adaptation and loss and damage at COP26 and CMA3, but I wanted to highlight a few of sort of what's coming next and what was decided at COP26 and CMA3 to provide some signals, and I'll have a few additional comments to make around that. From an adaptation standpoint, a 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation was established. So what is this global goal on adaptation? And I will actually read you word for word, and I'm a lawyer, and I think I have time. I will read you the first paragraph of Article 7 from the Paris Agreement, which is on adaptation. Parties hereby establish the global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change, with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal referred to in Article 2. I think that last phrase, the temperature goal referred to in Article 2, is critical, and we have heard from numerous speakers at this event that 1.5 and achieving 1.5 is really the goal right now. And so that adaptation and the work on adaptation needs to respond to our efforts to meet the mitigation efforts around 1.5 degrees. Also, and this is critical, is that developed countries have been urged to double adaptation finance as it was in 2019 by 2025. So there's a hortatory target for developed countries in terms of their adaptation finance response. And I think I would like to remind us of Juancho Lopez Tirualde's comments earlier in this event, that even though some of the things that are signed onto are not legally binding, they are what activists and advocates for particular issues can use to put pressure on governments to meet the commitments that they've made, certainly at COP26, but across the international process. From a loss and damage perspective, the Santiago Network, and again I'll read what that means, the Santiago Network, which was established in Madrid in 2019, where parties established as part of the Warsaw International Mechanism the Santiago Network for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change, to catalyze the technical assistance of relevant organizations, bodies, networks, and experts for the implementation of relevant approaches at the local, national, and regional level in developing countries to address loss and damage associated with the adverse impacts of climate change. So this Santiago network, which is an addition to the Warsaw International Mechanism for loss and damage under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, is meant to ensure that action on the ground takes place. And this is where I really believe that activism and advocacy for those groups of individuals that are feeling or experiencing the negative impacts of climate change and potentially irreversible damages need to be present, and they have been over the past 2 years. It's been a huge push, but that's not all. There needs to be a dedicated source of finance for countries that are experiencing loss and damage. And while developing countries were pushing a far more aggressive approach, the outcome was a dialogue on the Glasgow dialogue on funding to discuss funding arrangements for activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. I think that's an important first step, and how that dialogue manifests itself over the next 2 years is really critical, and I do think that this is an area again where activism can play a role. Next slide, please. All right, so trying to go down the signposting route and really signaling where I think activists for progressive outcomes on adaptation and loss and damage can be most effective. Again, I'll look at adaptation, I'll look at loss and damage. I know these are it's very small type, but from the global goal on adaptation perspective, the work program, the outcomes of that work program have to make sure that we're not looking at global statistics and trying to look at finance for adaptation on a global level. We have to realize that adaptation is country driven, that the metrics that are used to inform how well we are doing against this global goal are ones that come from countries, because every region has a different set of adaptation requirements. So we have to be sure that the outcomes of this global goal on adaptation work program are really geared towards the most vulnerable, and that they feel the benefits of the outcomes of that work program in terms of helping them to implement activities to adapt to climate change, and also be funded in their efforts. And more broadly, the advocacy for adaptation finance and holding governments to account for doubling adaptation finance by 2025 is also a critical outcome or aspect of advocacy around the outcomes of COP26 and CMA3. From a loss and damage perspective, the operationalization of the Santiago network, we have the functions of the network that were agreed at COP26 CMA3, but operationalizing that network and deciding on the institutional arrangements towards making that happen are still in play, and I think that's a very important area for activists to get involved in. The Glasgow dialogue on arrangements for funding, it's a bit of a loose set of conversations. Activists can help make that a tighter set of discussions and conversations that really leads to effective outcomes. And finally, not to forget that the Warsaw International Mechanism already has an executive committee that has expert groups in a range of different areas: slow onset events, non-economic losses, comprehensive risk management, human mobility, and action and support. It's working to provide outcomes, not to minimize the fact that there is architecture under the convention associated with loss and damage, and for activists to continue to be involved in the work of the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism. They have meetings twice a year. Observers are are admitted to attend and to be vocal. So that's my kind of small map of where activists around adaptation and loss and damage can get involved between now and COP27. Last slide, please. Thank you so much again for inviting me. This is a photograph of an individual who's taking a water tank into a very small Pacific island so that they can collect rainfall and have water in drought situations. And this is, I think, a very critical kind of visual image of the kinds of issues that not only small island states but all vulnerable countries are dealing with. This is what it's like on the ground. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak, and I certainly hope that I provided some important input into this really great event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. And indeed, I think it shows that there's the work must continue now. Once, especially in this area where there has been one more different timeline been put to the end of 2022. So we will have to follow up on that, of course. Just to make sure that, of course, this is for activists, but it's also, when we speak about organizing and activism, it's about parliamentary work, it's about civil society work, it's about the work that we do with researchers and think tanks. And so we see this kind of organization as a very large, broad spectrum of actions and activities. And we certainly, many of us are parliamentarians, so the main part of our bulk work will be within the European Parliament and national parliaments, of course. Now I will check back again if we have Carolina both in image and sound. How is the situation from Portugal? No sound. Speak a little bit more.
Mrs. Santos, can you unplug your headphones, please? Just that we test if your inbuilt mic would work. No, it's not working as well. My colleagues are sending you a request to change the microphone setting. Can you accept it? Once you get such a request, it will appear in the middle of your screen. Thank you very much. We're trying to get you on board.
Okay, so maybe I will ask for the technical support to sort that out, also the microphone at this moment. Okay. No. Okay, do you want us to wait another minute, or do you have things under control over there in technical? No. Okay, next. Okay, so Carolina, sorry about that. We will wait. Your intervention is very much awaited now, but don't worry, hang in there. We will sort out the microphone issue, I'm sure. So that brings us to Tsai Surui, who will speak to us about the role of indigenous people in just climate action. And I think this is an extremely important topic that were not sufficiently addressed in the COP26, and neither is sufficiently addressed, I would say, here in the European Parliament when we work on climate change issues. So please, the screen is yours. You will be with us remote as well. Ah, okay. Okay, so we are waiting for... I can either take a question, or is Carolina back? I was going to say on track. She is on track. It's just the technology that is not on track. Okay, okay. Let's see if Jens Holm, is he online or he's... No, okay. So let's then see if we have any questions from the participants here in the room or participants online also. Here, I have one question in the room, please.
Yes, thank you, Malin. I have a question for Linda. I would like to ask her to elaborate more on the loss and damage mechanism, and if she thinks that there can be a future in a more institutionalized way during the UNFCCC negotiations, because if the global north accepts that there is responsibility, then this might be translated into trillions of dollars in compensation to the global south. So this is a very, very technical, complicated, but also very political issue. And as he's an expert in UNFCCC negotiations, I would like to hear from her if she has any thoughts or reflections on that. Thank you.
Linda, are you with us remote here? Did you hear?
Yes,
yeah, please.
Yes, I am, and I hope you can hear me. And this is a very good friend of mine, and he's asked me a very difficult question, but I think one that has, for now, a rather straightforward answer. I think loss and damage has already been institutionalized under the UNFCCC and certainly under the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement recognizes the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. This was certainly a big win in 2013, and it continues to work through its executive committee and through mobilizing other organizations through the work of the executive committee. So I think there's already an institutionalization around loss and damage. I think perhaps part of the Paris Agreement deal, and I'm speaking in my own personal capacity here, not for governments certainly, was that the article on the Paris Agreement was a bit ring-fenced in terms of how it related to financial arrangements under the Paris Agreement, etc. And certainly there is a provision in Article 51 of the adopting decision 1 CP21, which was the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement, that says that the article on loss and damage under the Paris Agreement does not include liability and compensation. And so that discussions around that issue have always been difficult. I think that remains difficult. I think what was interesting, certainly anecdotally, at COP26, the Scottish government pledged a certain amount of funds towards loss and damage and characterized those funds as reparation. That reparation could be considered compensation, but that was not part of the discussions, the official discussions at COP26 and CMA3. And I really do believe that for now, to make progress on loss and damage considerations, we need to think about how this notion of liability and compensation is considered, and it's ring-fenced legally under agreements, and where we go. And I think this dialogue, this Glasgow dialogue that was agreed in the covering decision, the CMA3 covering decision, is potentially an arena for having those discussions going forward. So that's where I'll stop, Stavros, and thank you for the question.
Thank you, Linda. Now we'll make another attempt with Portugal. Carolina, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear
Finally.
and see you. Thank you for being with us. The screen is yours.
So I'll start. A juventude, historicamente, tem estado no epicentro de muitas lutas. Em Portugal, por exemplo, as lutas estudantis na década de 60 foram uma peça importante para na época mostrar que era possível fazer frente à ditadura fascista. Foram importantes por despertarem nos jovens a consciência de que havia um caminho possível além do da guerra e da submissão. Havia o caminho da resistência e da luta, e com todos os frutos que é possível colher dela, como a nossa Revolução dos Cravos, uns anos mais tarde, em 1974. Aos dias de hoje, no contexto em que vivemos, as contradições do capitalismo ficam também no plano ambiental. E perante isso, quem diria que a juventude ocuparia as ruas, mostrando disponibilidade para defender o que considera justo e um mundo melhor? Depois de décadas do proclamado fim da história, de todos os dias encherem as notícias e universidades de que não há alternativa ao capitalismo, ou que lutar e manifestar são coisas do passado. Por todo lado, a juventude percebe que alguém lucra com a destruição do planeta e que, imiscuídos nos governos e no poder político, os grandes grupos económicos têm objetivos antagónicos aos seus e aos da maioria da população. Não sendo isso obstáculo para que, mesmo assim, tentem efetivar os seus planos, escutando recursos a título da riqueza e até mercantilizando a própria natureza com o pretexto de que se está a resolver o problema, como vimos estes dias na COP26, com todo o teatro de falsas preocupações e lágrimas de crocodilo, com tantas promessas e ambições para, na realidade, ficar tudo na mesma. A juventude comunista portuguesa, desde o início, tem afirmado e continuará a afirmar que o capitalismo não é, nem nunca será verde. Capitalismo não é verde é a consigna com que os jovens comunistas portugueses têm participado nas manifestações em Portugal e que levaram igualmente a Glasgow nos protestos que decorreram à margem da COP, onde também estiveram presentes. Fim da COP, existem na panóplia de falsas soluções e propostas alegadamente pioneiras, como o mercado de carbono ou as zero emissões líquidas. Empurram as questões para a esfera individual, apontam o dedo aos nossos hábitos do dia-a-dia. Apelam a dietas específicas, supostamente amigas do ambiente, sem nunca criticar a total anarquia da distribuição de recursos deste sistema económico e a gestão irracional dos ciclos de produção e consumo, como, por exemplo, nas cantinas escolares portuguesas, comem-se maçãs produzidas em França e na Espanha, quando temos pequenos produtores no país com dificuldade em escoar o produto, e quando se privilegia a agricultura intensiva, nomeadamente com fundos da União Europeia, ao invés da agricultura familiar, que com o envelhecimento e desertificação do país se torna cada vez mais residual, consequência também da política agrícola comum, que tem sido uma aliada na perda da soberania alimentar. Apelam a que se usam carros elétricos e bicicletas, sem nunca apontar o transporte público e gratuito que se estenda por todo o território nacional, no caso de Portugal, como solução possível e a única viável. No tempo da monarquia, há 150 anos, havia mais quilómetros de linha férrea do que neste momento em Portugal. Também não revelam as suas intenções em torno do negócio do lítio, nem muito menos as suas consequências ambientais e demográficas. Usam a narrativa de que se reduzirmos e reciclarmos está tudo sob controle, que somos nós os culpados por tanto consumo, mas culpa temos nós de que existe um mercado só a impingir produtos e necessidades onde não existem, que se dedica a descobrir quais são os mecanismos inconscientes que potenciam as nossas escolhas e os instrumentalize de forma a que sejamos impulsivos e irracionais no momento de comprar. Ou que seja previamente acordado quanto tempo vai demorar até o nosso telemóvel se tornar obsoleto e deixar de funcionar. Que se programa o tempo de vida de tudo o que usamos, de forma a que a procura seja constante e não haja estagnação no mercado. Que culpa temos nós que nos tornem reféns de prazos de validade, mesmo contra a nossa vontade? E que a regulação, quer das artimanhas do marketing, quer da obsolescência programada, sejam poucas ou nenhumas e as entidades a quem cabe a fiscalização não sejam dotadas de meios suficientes. Também tentam que a batata quente passe para nós usando impostos. Em Portugal chamamos de fiscalidade verde, em que, sem nos darem verdadeiras alternativas, taxam as nossas opções, porque são poluentes. Além disso, fazem intenções de ter uma alegada transição justa, mas sem dotar o meio académico do devido financiamento e dos meios para que consigamos estar na vanguarda da pesquisa para soluções mais equilibradas e sustentadas que consigam, acima de tudo, assegurar a nossa soberania energética e evitem que estejamos suscetíveis a oscilações abruptas no mercado, como vemos agora com o preço dos combustíveis no nosso país. Culpam-nos das alterações climáticas, mas nunca nos dizem que a guerra é uma das indústrias mais poluentes que existe, a par de todas as atrocidades e violações dos direitos humanos que esta acarreta. Só o exército dos Estados Unidos polui mais do que muitos países desenvolvidos. Será impossível resolver o problema ou confiar na sua resolução nas mãos de quem o criou. E usando a mesma lógica que nos trouxe até aqui, só com soluções e políticas que peguem na raiz dos problemas as coisas mudarão. Mas os jovens, mais uma vez, estão no epicentro da luta, mobilizam-se, conversam sobre a problemática e, mesmo que de forma pouco consciente, saem à rua e exigem uma mudança. Muitas vezes ainda de uma forma abstrata e com cartazes que têm mais de engraçado do que reivindicativos, mas vão à rua, unem-se porque sabem que algo está errado e que a mudança não vai aparecer sem luta. E vimos como somos milhares por todo o mundo à procura de uma viragem no paradigma. O movimento juvenil é de facto poderoso e também por isso não se estranha as tentativas de instrumentalização por parte do grande capital de forma a limitar a sua ação. Por isso, investe-se tanto para delimitar os cantos da sala, a tirar termos abstratos, reivindicações distantes da preocupação da maioria dos jovens e promessas vagas. Por isso, quando alguns criticam um sistema, nós lembramos que esse sistema tem um nome, que é o capitalismo, onde a busca incessante do lucro se sobrepõe a tudo e a todos. Quando alguns falam de conflito geracional, nós lembramos que o conflito é de classes, que os nossos pais e avós não têm culpa do sistema económico. Da mesma forma que quando se refere a um norte global homogéneo, nos lembramos que são, na verdade, os crimes do imperialismo, particularmente dos Estados Unidos, da União Europeia e dos seus aliados, os verdadeiros responsáveis pelas guerras e brutais injustiças e desigualdades no mundo, pelas tentativas de utilizar tudo, incluindo o combate às alterações climáticas, para submeter os povos e os países às suas vontades. O objetivo e o grande desafio que se coloca, do ponto de vista da juventude comunista portuguesa, é de forma ampla pegar no que é consensual e alargar a luta. A partir dos problemas de fundo, que todos sentimos e vivemos, aumentar a consciência da juventude e mobilizar nas ações concretas por objetivos e reivindicações concretos. É isso que este momento exige. Perante a demagogia e a gula dos verdadeiros responsáveis pela degradação ambiental, respostas verdadeiras e justas, num esforço comum, mas logicamente diferenciado entre os países. Em Portugal, indo mais longe dos objetivos estabelecidos e garantindo a gratuitidade dos transportes públicos, apostando na produção local e nacional e no reforço dos meios Estados para defender a natureza. Uma resposta que reconhecemos para ser suficiente é indissociável de um diferente caminho de desenvolvimento e de um diferente modelo de sociedade. Por isso, a juventude comunista portuguesa luta pela superação deste sistema explorador, opressor, agressivo e predador, pelo socialismo rumo ao comunismo, onde o ambiente, a biodiversidade, o clima e todos os recursos naturais sejam valorizados, defendidos e o seu uso sustentável obedeça às necessidades das pessoas e não ao lucro de um punhado.
Thank you, Carolina, for that. I think it was quite clear for those of us that were in Glasgow also about the messaging around that the market and the capitalist structures don't have the solutions that we have to look for. Then we can have different solutions in terms of how to implement other structures that would deliver for addressing climate change. So thank you very much for that. Now I have two speakers left, and I see that they are both connected. So I'll start with Ktsai Surui, who will speak about the role of indigenous people in just climate action. You're very welcome. We're very happy that you could be with us, and you have the screen when you're ready.
Mr. Sururi, can you press the speak button once, please?
Vocês estão me ouvindo?
Yes, we can see you and hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Eu sou a Chay Suruí, sou ativista do povo Paité Suruí e estive na COP. Eu estou vindo aqui para falar um pouco sobre a nossa realidade, sobre o que a luta dos povos indígenas. Nós, né, povos indígenas, venho da Amazônia brasileira, nós lutamos todos os dias com as nossas vidas. A gente luta todos os dias. Falar da Amazônia é falar de uma discussão que deveria ser central, né? Uma discussão que deveria ser global, que todo mundo deveria estar falando. Porque falar da Amazônia é falar da vida de todo mundo no planeta. Nós, povos indígenas, estamos na linha de frente dessa luta e lutamos todos os dias com as nossas vidas. Falar de povos indígenas é falar da vida de todo mundo. A luta dos povos indígenas deveria ser a luta de todos. Na COP eu tive a oportunidade, né, de falar na abertura. E eu trouxe um pouco disso, da importância de nós estarmos no centro dessa discussão. E, principalmente, que nós sejamos participantes dessas decisões, porque a gente ainda está muito longe de decidir. E eles, né, aqueles que estão decidindo, que continuam sendo as mesmas pessoas, o mesmo norte global decidindo pelo futuro do planeta, a gente não faz parte dessas decisões, né? A gente ainda está longe de fazer parte disso. E a gente nunca vai alcançar a justiça climática sem que a gente alcance justiça social para os povos indígenas. A gente nunca vai alcançar a justiça climática enquanto a gente não lutar contra o capitalismo, enquanto a gente não lutar contra as desigualdades sociais, enquanto a gente não lutar por igualdade de gênero, enquanto a gente não lutar contra o racismo. Então, falar de justiça climática é falar também de pessoas, é falar também sobre o direito dos povos indígenas que vem sendo atacado todos os dias no Brasil. A gente está passando por um genocídio. Essa é a verdade. Os povos indígenas no Brasil estamos passando por um genocídio todos os dias. A gente tem criança morrendo de desnutrição, a gente está tendo os nossos rios envenenados, a gente tem todos os dias as nossas casas destruídas. E a gente está lutando todos os dias para que isso não aconteça, lutando todos os dias pelos nossos territórios, lutando todos os dias pela vida de todo mundo que vive na Amazônia e por todo mundo do planeta. Então, eu estou aqui não só, né, para trazer a importância da gente estar nessa discussão, mas para fazer essa denúncia mesmo. Eu estou aqui para denunciar o que está acontecendo na Amazônia e para denunciar para todos vocês que se a gente não fizer nada, se a gente não lutar, se juntar nessa luta pelos direitos dos povos indígenas, a gente está decretando o nosso fim, o fim da humanidade. A gente está destruindo e machucando a nossa mãe, a Mãe Terra. Meu pai me ensinou que a gente tem que escutar o que a Terra fala para a gente. E a gente não está sabendo ouvir. E tem uma coisa que eu tenho certeza, é que as soluções, elas vão passar e elas passam pela sabedoria dos povos indígenas. Nós vivemos milenarmente em harmonia com a natureza. E nos nossos territórios já existem as soluções sustentáveis e as soluções climáticas para salvar esse mundo, para adiar esse fim do mundo, para impedir a queda do céu. E vocês precisam nos ouvir. A gente já não tem mais tempo. Nosso tempo já acabou. E é isso. O mundo inteiro precisa se unir, precisa se juntar à luta dos povos indígenas para que a gente possa alcançar essa chamada justiça climática. Porque o que a gente viu na COP está muito longe de ser o que a gente espera e de ser o que a gente precisa. Porque, como eu disse, falar de mudanças climáticas é principalmente falar de pessoas. É falar do meio ambiente. E eu estou aqui para dizer isso, da importância de estar todo mundo ouvindo o que está acontecendo na Amazônia, de vocês estarem nos ouvindo. A juventude e os povos indígenas vieram aqui para dar esse recado. Esse recado de que não é 2030, não é 2050, de que é agora. E que a gente só vai alcançar tudo isso quando a gente demarcar a terra indígena, quando a gente tiver nossos direitos respeitados e quando a gente entender a importância da Amazônia para o mundo, a importância dos povos indígenas para o mundo. Não sei quando meu tempo acaba. E eu espero que todo mundo se una nessa luta. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, Sai, and for being with us. We know you're very busy, and I think you kind of it serves us very well to hear from you in terms of also changing the directions of the discussion and pinpointing what is actually the case, that we need you in this struggle. We cannot address the situation around the deforestation in Amazonia without your people. So I think this is very clear messaging from your side, and we look forward to continue to work with you to make sure that this, as I said before, you came into our meeting room, that this is a perspective that we don't have enough of in the European Parliament, certainly. People feel very far away from these discourses, I think, and these realities. However, as in the left group, we have organized initiatives about extravism in the Amazonia, and we will continue to focus on this. But thank you so much for being with us and for bringing that to the table. Now we have one more speaker left. It's Jens Holm. He is a member of parliament in Sweden from the Swedish Left Party, and he has written a so far national bestseller called Pandemia as an Opportunity. It has not yet been translated to Portuguese, German, and English, but I am sure it will not take long. And actually, this book and Jens himself often addresses some of the issues that have been raised here. That, in particular, also by our former panelist from Finance Watch, who said that during pandemia, lots of things were possible. And that's a good thing. And it has showed, what states and public policy can do. And I'm very happy to have you here, Jens, to tell us more about the reflections that you are having on this. So thank you for being with us. Back to you in Stockholm.
Mr. Holm, can you please press the speak button once? It's below on your screen.
Okay, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, but it's very dark and we cannot see you.
We can barely see you, Jens.
Yeah, it's very dark. I don't know why. Let's see here. Just a moment. Yeah, it's very dark. I don't know why it's so dark. I see if I can have some more light on my screen. No. I'm afraid you have to see me like this because I sit in a very bright room, but I look very dark. Yeah, that's correct.
Jens, I just have to tell you, I don't know how it is for the interpreters then, if it's possible to interpret without seeing, barely seeing you, Jens. I'm sorry.
Mm.
Do you have maybe something sticking on the camera or something like that?
Just a moment.
There's always something, Jens, so don't worry, there's always...
There is always something. Yeah, I can see if I can put on another spotlight here. You want me to do that?
Interpreters, do we need some more light to be able to interpret? Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so make another try because we have quite some interpretation going on here.
Okay.
We can wait a minute, Jens. We can wait a minute.
Just hang on.
Yeah. So I'm sorry about that, but many of us are very used to these things by now with either it's a microphone, the camera, the connection, something.
Didn't make much of a change, but little.
Yeah, it's a little bit better. I think this is, you know, seriously, we see your face. I think it's much better.
I can tell you, I have a spotlight right in my eyes, but if it's better for you, I speak this way, okay?
Well, you can close your eyes and speak also.
Oh,
No,
that's very difficult.
So please, the screen is yours, Jens.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind presentation, Malin. And the book I have written looks like this: "The Pandemic as an Opportunity: How we can make the restart just and sustainable." And to start, one could wonder, how could someone talk about the pandemic as an opportunity when so many people have suffered and killed, and our societies have been shut down during the pandemic? And now we see that the pandemic is sort of bouncing back. But at the end of the day, we can also see the pandemic as perhaps the best test bed for what we should do in order to solve the climate crisis. Because what do we need in order to address the climate crisis? Well, I would say we need at least three things. We need climate action, regulation. We need ambitious investments, and we need behavior change. Those three are very important. Is it possible to obtain more regulation, investments, and behavior change? Well, if we look at the pandemic as some kind of a rehearse for climate action, we can see that exactly those three things have been obtained during this now almost 2 years of pandemic. If I start with regulation, in a very, very short time, we had adequate regulation in place in the European Union and in our member states in order to, well, set up border controls, set up test and trace systems, how to run our public transport or not run public transport, facilitates for companies and authorities to have teleworking and other things. So in a very short time, our societies could regulate in order to cope with the corona crisis. The same goes with the need for investments. If we look at the public spending that has been carried out during the pandemic, If you look at Sweden, in only 1 year, in the 2020 and also in the 2021, so in a year and a half, about 40 billion euros have been spent in order to cope with the corona crisis. That is in order to help companies, authorities, persons that have been unemployed, etc. 40 billion euros, that is equivalent to 4,000 euros per person in Sweden. If you look worldwide, only during the year 2020, more than $12,000 billion were spent in public money in order to cope with the corona crisis. So we can see that, yes, money exists when it's needed. And what I think is interesting from a European perspective is that the EU has also decided that during the corona crisis, we should have what they call full flexibility when it comes to the financial regulations. So the old rules for how to spend public money with a ceiling for public debt, etc., that has not been put in place during the pandemic. The same is with the state aid rules, something that we in the left don't like very much. And the state aid rules, they have basically been put on a hold. And the European Commission has said that, well, during the corona crisis, you can spend a lot of money and you can support your public companies, etc. That's all fine as long as you save your societies. So we can see that there has been, yes, a possibility for another kind of financial hegemony during the corona crisis. When it comes to my third pillar in this, the need for behavioral change, well, we could see that it went very quick to change people's lifestyles during the corona crisis. We've seen the examples of teleworking. We've seen the examples of wearing face masks. We've seen also very fine examples of cooperation among neighbors, that one neighbor has helped perhaps elderly people to go shopping so they don't have to confront other people in the supermarket, etc. All in all, very big changes in how we are waging our lives in a very short time, basically. So I would say that during this less than 2 years of time, we have seen a kind of a minor revolution when it comes to the regulatory work, public spending, and lifestyle change. And I think we in the left, we should use this as a leverage to say that, yes, we can when it comes to climate action. Because we hear that very often, that no, there is no money. There is no possibility to legislate, or there is no way that people are interested in doing these big sacrifices in their daily life. Well, if we look at the pandemic, we can see exactly the opposite, that yes, we can basically do everything with the politics. We can find the needed financial resources in order to transform our societies. So, what is this? What should we do then? Well, of course, as I said, we should use the pandemic as an example. That yes, we could save our societies during the corona crisis. Now we have the real crisis, a crisis which is far more bigger than the corona crisis, and that is the climate crisis. And I think we have a very good case that we can bring up now, and we can say that yes, it is possible to regulate against fossil energy. We can stop the subsidies to fossil fuels. Today we subsidize fossil fuels with 5 times more than the 100 billion US dollars that was promised to the developing countries in the Copenhagen summit. So that is an awful lot of money. And we can also pinpoint that, yes, we can have a lot of public investments in order to transform our transport system, in order to have a more electric and sustainable transport system, but also invest in the public transport system as part of the recovery efforts after the corona crisis. During the corona crisis, we have also seen a lot of very interesting examples around in Europe how to build more sustainable cities. Cities like Paris, Barcelona, Milan, London, Berlin, etc. have shut down streets, converted them into pedestrian areas or bicycle lanes. Areas from cars have been converted to restaurant areas or to pop-up green areas, etc. And I think it's very important that we continue to do this, and that we make sure that this pop-up efforts should not only be pop-up temporarily, they should be permanent. And we can use the pandemic as an example that yes, people liked those decisions taken in the cities, and they would like to continue to have more sustainable cities like this. I think also we have a good case for investing in plant-based food. I think it was very interesting with the previous speaker on this issue, and we know that the animal factories is a big culprit when it comes to climate emissions, and also how badly animals are treated, etc. Now when we have the full flexibility of the financial regulation, we can use public money in order to support plant-based food. And that could also be an interesting new industry where we could find new workplaces for people. We can have many new innovations in the food system and so on. So I would like to finalize with saying that yes, the corona crisis has been awful in many respects, but when it comes to crisis management, it's actually an interesting example how we can manage a crisis, and we should use this as an example, as an opportunity, and say that, well, if we could deal with a crisis to handle one tiny little virus, and we could solve that, well, then we should step in and we should do the same, but 5 times more, and then we can solve the climate crisis. So we in the left have, we should put forward all this. And a pity that this book is not translated to English or Spanish or German or whatever, so you could read it, but it's a Swedish example, and I try to stick together all important issues that we have to deal with now after the corona crisis. And basically the challenges we have, they are basically the same in Sweden, in Germany, in Ireland, in Spain. It goes all together. And what we should do is to have a just transition, and we should build a more sustainable society. And the case to do that has been stronger with the corona crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jens. Very clear that I know your book is focusing on and zooming in on Sweden, of course, but I think if one would look in each of our countries about, you know, what kind of climate action, investment, and behavioral change, you will get examples that that from your country, what would, if you take what was possible during the COVID crisis to see what you would expect in facing the climate crisis, that we could formulate programs that really respond to what we're up against. So I have a few minutes left. If there are any questions to Jens or any one of the other speakers, please, we don't hesitate. I have one question here in the room, please.
Hi, thank you. So the question, I think many of the speakers brought it up, that we're exposed to these greenwash messages from very polluting companies, very often also via social media, but I would also add via normal media. There's so many advertisements in even the big newspapers. And it's of course not only the fossil fuel industry, although it's very much a topic related to today. Of course, a few years ago we had the debate about the access of Monsanto to this parliament. And as a food campaigner, I'm very, very irritated by all the advertisements of McDonald's and whatever have you, fast food on social media. Also when I look into the accounts of my nephews who should be shielded from that. So I thought that could be an interesting way also to maybe reframe the subject, also and taking back a new normal in banning these sort of brainwash activities from these polluting companies. But how do we do that? Because oftentimes if you speak about Facebook and Twitter, they're not even European based. So I was thinking maybe the speakers have some ideas on how to campaign on that issue. Thank you.
I will actually privilege a bit, because it's easiest also in terms of who's connected and not, to give the floor to our colleague from Silvia from Greenpeace, if you have any ideas around this.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it goes far beyond just fossil fuel companies, as you've mentioned, and it's also the case here in Brussels. We've seen there's many media events that are sponsored by companies that are not just fossil fuel companies. As you mentioned, Monsanto, there's also Bayer, etc., sponsoring conferences about food systems, or about health. So there's many of these examples. And it's not easy, as you said, to tackle this. Luckily, we have one good example that is the one of tobacco. So something similar has already been done. Seems like a massive operation to think about it now, but this has been done already a long time ago, focusing on one specific area, one specific project, but the rationale is there. So, for instance, the example of what we're trying to do with this European Citizen Initiative, focusing on fossil fuel companies, but also car manufacturers, airlines, etc. The rationale is exactly the same, and it would apply to EU rules because it applies to the internal market rules. So there are ways of doing this at the European level, and I think that for speaking specifically on fossil fuel companies, but I would say that people are quite aware of this on other issues as well. Like you mentioned food. I think there's a big momentum in terms of this. We've seen there's many initiatives at European level, national level, or city level, and these are all great examples. But the advantage of using a tool like the European Citizen Initiative is that you can catalyze this momentum towards one thing that will cover the European territory in one go. It's great. On advertisement, we've seen this happening in Amsterdam, in The Hague. It's being debated in Sweden as well, I know. But we simply, as many of the speakers have said, we don't have time to go about this issue like one by one, city by city. It will simply take too long. And initiatives like this are one tool, and this is a tool to bring it to the legislative table. But people in this room have a lot of power, and they can do this through, in the day-by-day, addressing different pieces of legislation. I work on energy. There's very often the possibility through individual pieces of legislation to influence this piece of legislation to make sure that fossil fuel companies do not have access to these decision-making processes or to certain things. So there's different ways to go about it. Certainly, like doing at the European level, top-down, covering all the EU in one go, it would be the best.
Thank you very much. I think this reflection will continue. I think one of the things that came up in several of the interventions has to do with democratization. I mean, in terms of, it's not a very democratic process that big corporations in fossil industry have influence over the policy-making process, while youth has to go out in millions in the streets to get heard. I think this is one aspect. Apologies. But also when it comes to investments, we see here at EU level that there's lots of public-private partnerships, and there is, as Jens said, millions going into handling the COVID crisis. I'm sorry, but this is not always a follow-up by public control.
Well, let's see if Malin gets better. I don't know if you need a glass of water. I will speak in my native language, Portuguese. So if you could bring on your headsets. Cabe-me dar aqui umas palavras finais nesta iniciativa. Não é fácil numa iniciativa desta natureza sintetizar. Aliás, poderíamos estar aqui 2 dias com os mesmos intervenientes e teríamos muito para discutir e para trocar opiniões e para aprofundar um conjunto de temas que naturalmente o tempo que dispusemos não permitiu aprofundar. Parece-me atrever-me a dizer que, tal como aqueles que estiveram e que acompanharam a COP26, enfim, de uma forma mais próxima ou mais à distância, nós tivemos a oportunidade do grupo de ter uma delegação na COP26, onde até alguns destes oradores estiveram também, marcaram também presente. Mas parece-me que o sentimento que trazemos de lá, tal como o sentimento que perpassa das intervenções que ouvimos hoje ao longo desta tarde, é a de uma natureza insuficiente e muitas vezes inadequada das respostas a dar face à dimensão dos problemas objetivos com que estamos confrontados. Uma resposta tantas vezes maquilhada de verde, não é? O chamado greenwashing, não deixa de ser assinalável que uma boa parte destas respostas resultam daqueles que ao longo do último século foram responsáveis também pelo elevadíssimo nível e o aumento das emissões e pela situação com a qual hoje nos estamos a confrontar. As grandes potências poluidoras, as grandes multinacionais, muitas das soluções, algumas falsas soluções, resultam precisamente destes intervenientes. Também na COP26 e nas iniciativas onde tivemos a oportunidade de participar, e com pistas que aqui hoje foram lançadas, não é? Problemas que resultam de soluções como o offsetting ou soluções como o net zero, onde na verdade não se trabalha onde se deveria trabalhar, que é na redução efetiva de emissões, e portanto criamos aqui uma solução que não se dirige de uma forma objetiva ao problema concreto com que estamos confrontados, enfim, que perpetuam, ao fim e ao cabo, o direito a poluir através de soluções de mercado que se vão mantendo, assentes naturalmente no aprofundamento da liberalização e concentração de setores e, em primeiro lugar, na garantia do lucro para as grandes multinacionais. Houve aqui vários elementos em torno das questões da energia. Era importante debatermos aqui também não apenas das soluções efetivas, mas de como a energia deve ser considerada um bem público e da necessidade de reverter o controle público do setor energético como forma de garantir que a resposta que é necessária responda aos problemas efetivos das populações. As questões do transporte e da mobilidade, que eu penso que aqui acabaram por não ser tão trabalhadas e discutidas, mas que são fundamentais também, tendo em conta o elevadíssimo nível de emissões que o transporte é hoje responsável, mas que não pode justificar uma transição do transporte individual a combustão para um transporte individual elétrico sem resolver os problemas de fundo da mobilidade e sem dar uma resposta aos transportes públicos que são necessários. A questão da produção e a necessidade da produção local e do consumir local, que naturalmente compete com estratégias, nomeadamente no comércio internacional, que agudizam muitos destes problemas que aqui foram trazidos, e como muitas destas questões muitas vezes impactam não nos nossos países, mas em países terceiros. Aliás, o exemplo das comunidades indígenas é um exemplo paradigmático de como muitas vezes estas soluções têm impactos noutras comunidades e são resolvidas são abordagens que, na verdade, se traduzem em novas formas de um neocolonialismo. Ora, se é necessário tomar medidas na dimensão ambiental, é fundamental que as medidas não tenham apenas uma dimensão ambiental, ou não será possível uma transição que seja efetivamente justa. É preciso ter uma dimensão também social, de justiça, que comporte justiça social. Falava-se aqui dos apoios aos países terceiros. Ora, se os apoios aos países terceiros, além de insuficientes, somam dívida às dívidas que os países em desenvolvimento já têm, não estamos a contribuir para resolver, de facto, e para promover essa justiça social. E é por isso que o ativismo com que terminamos este segundo painel é fundamental. É fundamental para mudar consciências, para elevar consciências, para garantir também que no plano das políticas dos próprios governos e com isso a uma escala maior se procedam a alterações que são necessárias e que ainda não estão a ser verdadeiramente adotadas. É através desta mobilização da sociedade em diversas frentes, em diversas áreas de intervenção, que se fará também essa mudança fundamental, que se reconhecerá algo que aqui foi dito, que o capitalismo não é verde e que é necessário, como este próprio painel indicava, mudar o sistema para que de facto possamos intervir nas questões climáticas com que estamos confrontados. Eu não me alongaria mais, gostaria de saudar e agradecer àqueles que participaram e contribuíram com as suas intervenções neste painel e com um extenso conteúdo de materiais para reflexão e para aprofundarmos a reflexão. Agradecer àqueles que nos acompanharam na sala ou através das redes e, inevitavelmente, também agradecer aos intérpretes pelo trabalho que desempenharam, por vezes nem sempre aqui com uma ou outra dificuldade técnica, mas que conseguimos superar. Muito obrigado. Penso que poderíamos, a Malin já regressou, mas penso que poderíamos dar por terminada esta muito interessante e importante debate, que de facto lança aqui muitas ideias para aquilo que é necessário fazer na sequência da COP26. Obrigado.